I know you didn't have time to get into Russia, but could you capsulize the contrast between the setting of oil in Russia and, say, Nigeria, and the people behind it, and who's profiting?
Well, I went to Russia, and I spent some time with one of the oil billionaires, a guy named Vaget Alikperov, who's the chairman and largest single shareholder of Lukoil. He's worth many billions of dollars now. And when I went into his office in the Lukoil Tower, you know, beautiful office, you know, Scandinavian wood and you know, perfect leather chairs and all that, I noticed on his desk, in the place where you would expect the picture of the wife and daughter to be, the picture of Vladimir Putin instead. and this was at the time just after Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the largest shareholder and owner of Yukos, which was the main competitor in the private sector to Lukoil, just after Khodorkovsky had been arrested. And Khodorkovsky was arrested because basically he decided, instead of supporting Putin and the Russian government as it was, he was going to support the opposition. And Putin made the decision that he could not afford to have a billionaire, a multi-billionaire, funding the opposition. And Putin also decided that Khodorkovsky, and this was not known so well at the time, but since it's become clear, was in negotiations with Exxon to sell a portion of Yukos to Exxon. And so for political reasons, to eliminate an opposition figure, but also to keep Russia's national resources within Russian control, Khodorkovsky was arrested. Yukos was basically appropriated by the state. It no longer exists. And it gets to, maybe this isn't quite the question you were getting at, but to me it got to a really interesting question, because on the one hand, you know, you say like, well, what Putin did was terrible, and you know, one of the problems in Russia is that oil, and there's so much oil there, is basically owned and controlled by the government, has concentrated power in the government. The government has become really about kind of managing oil, both on an economic level and on a political level internationally. But what happened in Russia kind of reveals just, in some ways, an unresolvable problem, because what do you do when you have oil resources that are so large and so concentrated? And this is where oil is different from wheat, is different from you know, automotive factories, because those other sectors, there are a lot of people involved, a lot of stakeholders. The wealth is kind of spread out, diversified. There are a lot of people involved. With oil, it's concentrated. If you have it in the hands of people like Khodorkovsky, who, by the way, although he was supporting the opposition, was not a gentle man. He, as one of the oligarchs, had really kind of been running roughshod over the Russian political and economic system. You can have it in the hands of the private sector people like him, who then control the government. Or you have it in the control of the government, which then becomes super concentrated, super powerful, begins to ignore other sectors, becomes very corrupt. And it's almost an unresolvable situation. In America, we have, I think, a good kind of ownership situation with private citizens who, if you find oil in your backyard, it's yours. You get an oil company to come in, but you get the royalties. In countries like Russia, that doesn't happen. So how do you kind of divide up the power that oil represents in such concentrated ways? And Russia hasn't done that. And the problem with it is that incomes have risen because prices have risen. And so Russia's in better shape now in terms of incomes than it was 8 or 9 years ago. But what happens when production peaks or goes down? What happens when prices don't keep rising? And this is kind of actually, when you look behind the scenes of what brought down the Soviet Union, one of the triggers was that the price of oil collapsed in the 1980s, as did Soviet production. And that was one of the reasons why Gorbachev's reforms failed. He had no money to kind of shore up the Soviet economy. And the same kind of thing could happen in Russia one day too. So it's this is part of the curse of oil, in the sense of like, when things are good, they're great. But when they're not great, they fall apart.